They say the guillotine never sleeps. But that night in Paris, it hesitated, just for a second, before the blade came down on the man who had once called himself the voice of virtue. The man who wanted to rebuild the human soul through terror. The man who believed morality could be enforced at gunpoint, and purity, achieved through blood. His name was Maximilien Robespierre. And as the executioner ripped off the bandage holding his shattered jaw together, a sound escaped him that Paris would never forget, a muffled, animal scream, half human, half divine. The scream of a man who thought he could become God, and failed. But before that sound came the silence. A silence that had taken years to build. It began in 1789, with candles flickering over the Declaration of the Rights of Man, a document that promised liberty, equality, fraternity. And it ended in 1794, with headless corpses piled high in the Place de la Révolution. Between those years, France had torn itself apart in the name of moral purity. But no one embodied that dissent more completely than Robespierre, the Incorruptible. He was not a conqueror. He was not a general. He was a lawyer. A man of ideals so rigid they could cut through flesh. He believed that reason could perfect humanity, that God could be replaced by virtue, and virtue by law. But when law failed, he turned to fear. Fear, he said, was nothing but justice, swift, severe, inflexible. And in that twisted logic, the guillotine became an altar, and blood a form of worship. The revolution devoured its enemies, then its friends, then its children. By the summer of 1794, Paris stank of iron and rot. The executioners were exhausted, the crowd numb. Yet Robespierre believed it was not enough. To save the soul of the nation, he said, France must have a new faith, a religion beyond the church, beyond kings, beyond God himself. He called it the cult of the Supreme Being. And so, for one final, impossible moment, Robespierre climbed a man-made mountain in the center of Paris and declared himself the high priest of a new world. The crowd cheered. But behind their eyes, something shifted. In that instant, France saw not a savior, but a tyrant wearing the mask of God. It happened on June 8, 1794. The sun rose over Paris, but the light felt strange that morning, too perfect, too deliberate, as if the heavens themselves had been staged for a performance. Drums thundered, banners of blue and white rippled in the wind, and thousands of citizens marched behind flowers and flags. But this was not a Christian procession. The churches were silent. Crosses had been torn from the walls. Even the word God had been banned. In its place, one man stood before the nation and proclaimed a new divinity, the Supreme Being. And at the center of it all, draped in blue silk, his eyes burning with messianic certainty, stood Maximilien Robespierre. He had designed this day himself, down to the final note of the choir. He led the people like a prophet leading the chosen, holding a torch to symbolize the triumph of reason over superstition. Behind him, effigies of atheism and egoism were set aflame, their ashes scattering in the air like the ghosts of an old faith. The crowd shouted, "Vive Robespierre!" And for the first time, France bowed not before a king, but before a man who claimed to speak for morality itself. But there was something wrong in the way they looked at him. Too much awe. Too much fear. Even his allies began to whisper, "Has the Incorruptible lost himself?" You see, Robespierre didn't want power the way tyrants do. He wanted purity. And purity, in the wrong hands, becomes the most dangerous addiction of all. He believed that by purging corruption, he was serving divine justice. But in truth, he was serving his own reflection, the image of a man who could not tolerate imperfection, not in others, not in himself. Behind the festival's painted smiles, Paris was cracking. The prisons overflowed. Children recited patriotic hymns while their parents vanished overnight. To question Robespierre's faith was to die as an enemy of virtue. And so France entered a new kind of worship, not of God, but of fear disguised as holiness. When the festival ended, Robespierre stood on his artificial mountain, gazing down upon a trembling nation. In that moment, he wasn't a revolutionary anymore. He was something else, something far older. A man repeating the same ancient pattern of every priest, every emperor, every ruler who ever tried to control the human soul by invoking heaven. After the festival of the Supreme Being, something inside Robespierre snapped. He had looked into the mirror of divinity and seen his own reflection staring back, and it terrified him. From that day, his speeches grew sharper, colder, edged with paranoia. He began to see corruption everywhere, in the assembly, in the clubs, in the very men who had once cheered his name. The revolution, he said, was surrounded by traitors disguised as patriots. And he would root them out, one by one, until only the pure remained. But what is purity, when measured by a man who believes himself chosen? It becomes a weapon sharper than the guillotine itself. Soon, the Committee of Public Safety, originally built to protect the revolution, became an invisible court of fear. Neighbors whispered about neighbors. Judges condemned men without evidence. Even laughter could be suspicious, a sign of hidden treason. Robespierre had mastered not only the politics of fear, but the psychology of it. He knew that once a man begins to police his own thoughts, you no longer need to threaten him. The human mind becomes the perfect prison. He created laws so vague that anyone could be guilty, and that was the brilliance of it. Guilt became universal, and so did submission. People learned to perform virtue, to act pure even when they felt corrupt inside. The revolution had become theater, and Robespierre was both director and deity. Each speech he gave became a sermon. Each execution, a sacrament. His words dripped with the rhythm of divine justice. Terror, he said, is nothing but prompt, severe, inflexible justice. It is therefore an emanation of virtue. Think about that for a moment. He made violence sound holy. He made fear sound moral. And when morality is defined by fear, anything can be justified. By the summer of 1794, France was no longer a nation, it was an experiment. The first modern experiment in psychological control. Robespierre had discovered that true domination does not come from chains or guns, it comes from convincing people that obedience is a sign of goodness. That submission is moral. That fear is sacred. And in that twisted belief, he did something no tyrant before him had ever achieved. He turned the human conscience into a weapon against itself. By July of 1794, the city of Paris had become a whispering tomb. Every knock at the door could mean death. Every flicker of candlelight could be the last thing you saw before the men from the committee came. And at the center of this suffocating silence sat Robespierre, alone, sleepless, haunted by the ghosts of those he had sent to the blade. His friends no longer called on him. His enemies were invisible, multiplying in the dark. He began to speak less of liberty and more of purity. His eyes sank deep into his skull. He stopped eating, stopped smiling, and began to pace the floors at night, muttering to himself about betrayal. They have all turned against virtue, he said. Against me. The incorruptible was now corrupted by fear, the same fear he had taught the people to live by. The hunter was becoming the hunted. Every morning, new names appeared on the lists of the condemned, judges, generals, poets, even the men who had built the revolution itself. The tribunals no longer asked if you were guilty. They asked only when you had become an enemy. France had become a mirror of its own madness. In every household, men rehearsed their innocence aloud, as if speaking it might make it true. Robespierre, meanwhile, began to write long drafts of speeches that no one wanted to hear. He spoke of unseen conspiracies, plots by atheists, moderates, and false patriots. But the assembly had grown tired of his sermons. They feared that one day, their names too would find their way to his lists. So they began to conspire, not to overthrow tyranny, but to survive it. And in the candlelit corridors of the convention, a new fear was born. What if Robespierre never stops? He had become a ghost walking among men, a prophet preaching damnation to a congregation that wanted silence. And yet, he could feel it. The shift. The eyes that once looked up now looked away. The applause that once thundered now faltered. Power, like faith, is a fragile thing, it dies the moment belief fades. That night, as Robespierre looked out from his balcony over a city drenched in quiet terror, he whispered to himself, "I am alone with virtue." But even he no longer believed it. Halfway through this descent, I want you, yes, you, to type in the comments, "Virtue without mercy is tyranny." Write it twice. Once for the man Robespierre became, and once for the man you must never become. It began on the night of July 26, 1794. Robespierre stood before the National Convention, pale and trembling, his voice cracking under the weight of paranoia and exhaustion. He accused the government itself of conspiracy, of betrayal, of moral decay. But he refused to name names. And that was his fatal mistake. The men sitting before him, Carnot, Tallien, Billaud, felt the noose tighten around their own necks. In that moment, every man in the room realized something terrible: if Robespierre lived another day, they would not. As his speech ended, silence filled the hall, thick, electric, dangerous. Then came the first spark of rebellion, a murmur, then a shout, and finally, defiance. For the first time, someone dared to interrupt the incorruptible. The spell broke. His power, built on fear and illusion, began to crumble. He left the hall shaken, unaware that the men he had condemned in his mind were already plotting his end in reality. The next night, they came for him. The Commune tried to protect him, but the soldiers, once his faithful servants, now hesitated. Paris was done bleeding for virtue. In the chaos, shots were fired. When they found him hours later, Robespierre was slumped against a table in the Hôtel de Ville, half-conscious, his jaw shattered by a bullet. Whether it was suicide or an assassin's mercy, no one could say. His once commanding voice was gone forever. Dawn broke cold and gray. The streets were eerily calm. As the soldiers dragged Robespierre through the square, the same crowd that had once chanted his name now spat at him, laughed, hurled curses. His blue coat was stained with blood, his face wrapped in a crimson-soaked bandage. At last, the architect of terror had become its final victim. When he reached the guillotine, he tried to speak, but only a wet gasp came out. The executioner ripped off the bandage, tearing open the wound. That sound, the gurgling scream of the man who tried to become God, echoed through the square as the blade fell. The incorruptible was dead. But the idea that created him, the dream of a perfect world built on fear, was not. It never really dies. It just changes its name, its flag, its language. And it waits, for the next believer. When Robespierre's head fell, Paris exhaled. The nightmare, they thought, was over. But fear is not so easily killed. It seeps into the walls, into the laws, into the habits of obedience. And though the guillotine was silent, its logic survived, refined, hidden, modernized. France buried Robespierre, but kept his invention, the machinery of moral control. You see, Robespierre's true creation was never the cult of the supreme being. It was something far more enduring, a system where power wears the mask of virtue. A system that teaches men to love their own servitude, to mistake surveillance for safety, and conformity for morality. He discovered that you don't need kings or gods to rule mankind, you just need to convince them that submission is righteous. After his death, the revolution devoured itself, then rebuilt under new banners. Napoleon rose from the ashes, a soldier turned emperor, carrying Robespierre's ghost in his sword. Across Europe, nations began to copy the French model: centralized power, patriotic obedience, control through ideology instead of religion. The names changed: liberty, progress, equality, but the structure remained the same. The age of divine kings had ended. The age of divine governments had begun. Think about that. Today, We live surrounded by invisible guillotines, social systems that punish thought crime, moral courts that decide who is pure, who is guilty, who deserves silence. They no longer need a blade, they use algorithms, media, institutions of truth. The faces have changed, but the psychology is identical. Fear disguised as righteousness. Control disguised as justice. Robespierre believed he was purifying humanity. But what he really did was design the first prototype of ideological slavery, a cage so elegant that men built it themselves and called it freedom. His cult of virtue has evolved, digitized, globalized. And now, instead of one incorruptible man, we have millions, each one watching, judging, condemning, in the name of moral perfection. So ask yourself, when you censor your thoughts to avoid judgment, when you obey not because you must, but because it feels virtuous, whose dream are you living in? Robespierre is long dead, but the Supreme Being still lives, no longer in temples or speeches, but in the collective mind of a species that cannot resist worshipping its own reflection. Here's the truth they never wanted you to see: Robespierre was not an accident of history. He was a reflection, a mirror held up to mankind. Every empire that falls, every revolution that devours its children, every system that promises salvation but delivers chains, all of them are born from the same sickness, the human obsession with moral perfection. The desire to become God. Robespierre's tragedy was not that he was evil. It was that he was sincere. He believed that if men were forced to be virtuous, the world would finally be free. But that's the oldest lie ever told, the same lie whispered in Eden, the same lie that built temples, empires, and wars. The lie that perfection can be engineered. That salvation can be imposed. That purity justifies cruelty. But purity is just control dressed in white. And control, no matter how noble its disguise, is still slavery. The deeper truth is this: every generation builds its own cult of the Supreme Being. Some worship reason. Some worship ideology. Some worship technology. And some worship themselves. The methods change, but the hunger stays the same, a hunger to dominate, to define, to cleanse what doesn't fit the image. Humanity keeps replaying Robespierre's nightmare because it cannot face the truth that no one, not king, not prophet, not system, has the right to define virtue for all. The only revolution that has ever mattered is the one that happens inside you. When you stop begging for permission to think. When you stop worshipping the illusion of moral superiority. When you see that freedom isn't given, it's remembered. That's the moment you step outside the machinery. That's when the whispers of control lose their power. You are not meant to be pure. You are meant to be aware. To see the game. To walk through the ruins of false gods and keep walking. And so I'll ask you, one last time, if you've come this far, if something in you has shifted, write it again below, and write it twice: virtue without mercy is tyranny. Because the world still builds altars to men who think they can save it. But those who see, those who understand, know the secret Robespierre never did: no man becomes God, without first becoming a monster.